Good day, everybody. Welcome to Rocky Mountain Readings, where we've been into a beautiful book called The Talmud, a Biography. Banned, censored, burned, the book they couldn't suppress. And I am finding this quite a wonderful historical overview of how the Talmud was formed and the trials and tribulations and the political pressures and all the outlining effects on its formation, the schools that were involved, and how the Babylonian Talmud gained its supremacy over the Jerusalem Talmud, which had to do with dating process. And that's just exciting to see and understand. And we're going to continue with this today. And today we're in part 2. We're about halfway through this book. So today we're on the Talmud in the World, part 2 of this book, chapter 9, Banned, Censored, and Burned, the 13th Century. So we're just past the time of the Rambam and Rashi, and we've heard a little bit. Nahum of Gamza used to say, even this is for the best. It seems to me, Jew, that I dare not declare that you are human, lest perchance I lie, because I recognize that reason, that which distinguishes human beings from beasts, is extinct in you, or in any case buried. Truly, why are you not called brute animals? Why not beasts? Why not beasts of burden? The ass hears but does not understand. The Jew hears but does not understand. And then he's got a cite here. With these words, the 12th century abbot of Cluny, Peter the Venerable, vented his frustration with the Jews. They had once again failed to listen to his arguments, showing the Talmud to be false and proving the divinity of Jesus. They just don't know when to stop. Peter was the head of a powerful international monastic movement who devoted much of his life to the study of other faiths. Peter pioneered the study of both Islam and Judaism, but his interest was far from academic. In those days, many religious thinkers were polemicists, anxious to prove the truth of their faith and the falseness of any other belief. By all accounts, Peter was a saintly and politically influential man who had the ear of kings and popes. He had defended Peter Abelard against the accusations of Bernard of Clairvaux, and after Abelard's death, had acceded to Helois's request to grant him absolution from his sins. He was also a polemicist par excellence. Peter first encountered Islam during a visit to Spain, sparking an interest which led him to commission the translation of Islamic texts into Latin. He then devoted much of his time to writing refutations of the Muslim faith. Eventually, he turned his attention to Judaism, becoming one of the first to discuss the Talmud, a work which he held in contempt and ridicule. Peter's work came at a time when Christian scholars were realizing that their attempts over the last 1,000 years to prove the Jews wrong from the Bible were not working, because the Jews had their own tradition of biblical interpretation, a tradition that was contained in the Talmud. The Christians were beginning to realize the significance of the Talmud to the Jews and to understand that if they wanted to prove the Jews wrong, they would need to do it by refuting the Talmud, not by bringing arguments from the Bible. Very important. See, this is 900 years ago, and they still haven't got the message. The Jews would not accept Christian interpretations of the Old Testament. They had their own, which were stored in the Talmud. Peter's lifelong attempts to show both Muslims and Jews the errors of their ways marked the beginning of an onslaught on both religions over the next 100 years or so. Chief amongst the aggressors were the Dominican friars. The American historian Salo Baron challenged the Lacrimose view of Jewish history. He took exception to the popular view, reinforced by 19th century historians, that the Jews had been the most persecuted group in history. He argued that, for example, during the Middle Ages, life for Christian peasants was far worse. To be sure, there were horrific events, crusaders, assaults, pogroms, and the carnage that followed in the wake of blood libels, recurring accusations that Jews had ritually slaughtered Christian children and used their blood to bake Passover bread. But to understand the history of the Jews in any particular period, one had to look at what they were doing with their lives. They were not constantly under attack, and when they were not, they were living creative lives, learning, working, reading, teaching, raising families, and promoting the way of life they believed in. The history of the Talmud, which has paralleled the history of the Jews, supports Salo Baron's view. By and large, it has been a successful history. Followers of the Talmud have explored the deepest intellectual oceans, traversed broad plains of knowledge and ideas, created and sustained communities, and attained a clear and uncompromising sense of personal identity and self-knowledge. But that's not to say they weren't lachrymose periods, tearful events in the life of the Talmud and its devotees. The 13th century in Christian Europe was one such time. Well, my mother, Sheila, is not with us today because she had optical surgery the other day. We wish you a full healing, Sheila. The Disputation in Paris. Institutional prejudice against the Jews took a giant step forward when Pope Innocent III was elected in 1198. Paying lip service to the earlier papal bull, Sicut Judaeus, which had granted limited protection to the Jews in papal lands, Innocent introduced measures to distinguish Jews from Christians, including a requirement for them to wear distinctive clothing. He drew clear lines between Orthodox and heretical Christian beliefs and urged bishops Okay. His successor, Gregory IV, pushed these reforms further, handing power to mendicant order to assert his authority. Jeremy Cohen notes that the condemnation and persecution of rabbinic literature by the late medieval church marked an important milestone in the history of Christian-Jewish relations. In 1236, Nicholas Donin, a Dominican friar who had been born a Jew but converted to Christianity, appeared before Pope Gregory IV. He brought with him a list of 35 charges that he had compiled against the Talmud. Amongst Donin's accusations were the charge that the Jews believed the Talmud came from God, that Christians who studied it were to be punished by death, and that God is capable of sinning. Ugh. Notwithstanding the institutional climate driven by the papacy, it has been suggested that Donin's specific motive for this was to seek revenge against his former teacher, Hillel of Paris. Hillel had apparently excommunicated Donin for his heretical views, the same views, no doubt, which had led to his conversion to Christianity. It took the Pope nearly 3 years to respond to Donin's charge. When he did, he sent Donin off with a letter to be delivered to the Bishop of Paris. The bishop was ordered to issue instructions to the kings of France, England, Portugal, and the Spanish that all copies of the Talmud and other Jewish books in their lands were to be confiscated. The Pope demanded that the confiscation was to take place on the first Sabbath in Lent, that all confiscated books be examined, and any which contained material contradictory to the Christian faith were to be burnt. The kings weren't too impressed. Sorry, too many texts, folks. The kings weren't too impressed with the Pope's edict. England, Spain, and Portugal ignored it. The only king to react was Louis IX of France, and his response was far from the Pope's original demand. Instead, Louis offered the Jews an opportunity to publicly defend the Talmud. He ordered that a public debate take place in which Donin would confront the leading rabbis of France with his charges. It was not the first debate or disputation to take place between Christians and Jews, and nor would it be the last. But this debate was very different from anything that had gone before. Previously, either the Christians had sought to prove to the Jews that the Hebrew Bible had foretold the coming of Jesus, or the Jews had initiated the debate, attempting to prove the reverse. The debate centered on the interpretation of passages in the Hebrew Bible. The Christians quoting verses from the Jewish prophets that they believed supported their view, the Jews using their tradition of interpretation, which the Christians had recently discovered was bound up in the Talmud, to try to prove them wrong. Even Salomon would accept that in 13th century France, Jews had a hard time of it. They were restricted in the trades they could perform, were subjected to blood libels, had been attacked and slaughtered by crusaders, and were generally treated as inferior and unwelcome. What is interesting about the previous debates is that despite the power and authority vested in the church, the Jews had the upper hand. Christianity was trying to justify its existence, and not, as might have been expected, the other way around. In matters of religious belief, since Christianity depended on the Hebrew Bible, the Jews represented the status quo. It fell to Christianity to prove that it was right, not Judaism to prove the other faith wrong. But the debate between Donin and Yehiel was different. This time, Judaism was on the back foot, forced to defend itself. Not only that, but the heart of the debate was no longer how to interpret biblical texts, which were claimed by both religions. Instead, it was the validity and integrity of the Talmud, which was at stake, even though it was a rabbinic text which, until recently, had been of no interest to Christianity at all. The debate took place in the royal court in Paris on the 25th and 26th of June, 1240, in the presence of the leading French clergy and Queen Blanche, the king's mother. Important. Nicholas Donin appeared as prosecutor of the Talmud. Yehiel and his colleague, Rabbi Moses of Corsi, were its defenders. It was a tense and dramatic occasion. Everyone was aware that the stakes riding on it were high. For Yehiel, it was an intimidating environment, no doubt. When he came before the queen and the princes in the king's court, the rabbi was alone there with the throng, the queen, the clergy, the rules, and all the knights, great and small. Of the Israelites, there was not one. Our knowledge of the debate comes from the accounts written by the protagonists, Rabbi Yehiel and Nicholas Donin. Donin's account was in Latin and Yehiel's in Hebrew. Of course, they each wrote their accounts after the debate had taken place. They each had an axe to grind, and the two documents, therefore, are neither word-for-word transcriptions, nor do they necessarily agree with each other. Donin's account of the disputation is held in the French Bibliothèque Nationale. It is appended to the Extractions des Talmud, a work composed by Jewish converts to Christianity, which purports to list all the incriminating passages in the Talmud. The philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas probably had a copy of the Extranes in front of him when he composed his polemic against disbelief, the Summa contra Gentiles, in which he misunderstands the Talmud in a similar manner to Donin. It might be thought that the scholarly and rational Aquinas, who used the writings of Maimonides to help him expound biblical laws, would help improve Christian understanding of the Talmud. In fact, the opposite seems to have happened. His attention to Scripture led him to a literal understanding of biblical Judaism, which failed to recognize the role and purpose of the Talmud in the reality of a post-biblical world. It has been argued that Yehiel was less interested in reporting the cut and thrust of the debate than writing an account which would function as a guide for future disputants. His report doesn't just set out the arguments he used, which he felt others should follow. It also helps others who might find themselves in a similar position to prepare by describing the atmosphere in the court in detail and the manner in which the audience behaved. Yehiel tried to explain that the Talmud was an essential, divinely given companion to the Bible, that without it, the Bible could not be understood. He tried to rebut Donan's specific charge one by one. Many of the charges that Donan had laid were based upon the parts of the Talmud known as Agadah, which do not deal with law or religious practice, but instead introduce fables, folk tales, stories, magic, and cosmology. Yehiel argued that these passages are intended to draw the heart of a person. If he wants, he can believe them. If he doesn't want to, he need not believe them. Donan mocked the Talmud statement about the disagreements between Hillel and Shamai. These and these are the words of the living God. How can God change his mind, he asked. Yehiel's answer was that the statement refers to legal decisions that are reached by majority vote. If a majority in one community decide differently from a majority elsewhere, both decisions are valid. Yehiel refuted the charges that the Talmud is disparaging to Christians, arguing that Donan misunderstood. The passages that Donan claimed referred to Christians actually referred to pagans and idolaters. This is obviously so, since the Christian faith had hardly reached Babylon when the Talmud was under composition, and its authors were neither particularly knowledgeable about it nor fearful of it. The Talmud aflame. Donan's charges against the Talmud were artificial, and Yehiel's attempts at deference torturous, but of course this was never going to be a fair contest. It was no surprise that Yehiel didn't win the debate, and what really mattered was not the outcome, but what happened next. The consequence of Yehiel's defeat were far-reaching. 2 years after the debate in 1242, a papal commission condemned the Talmud and urged Louis IX to issue an edict for all copies of the Talmud to be burnt. Louis was not slow to react. He dispatched inspectors across the realm, charging them to ransack the Jewish neighborhoods in both cities and the villages. The inspector, most of whom could not read Hebrew, were unable to tell which volumes were copies of the Talmud and which were not. They confiscated everything they found. Books were the lifeblood of Jewish life. The people may have been poor, as in the Middle Ages, but they had pride in their learning. Their books were often all they had. Study was an end in itself, and the highest aspiration of any Jewish parent was that their sons would become a rabbinic scholar, an authority in Talmud. They wouldn't have given up their holy books without a fight. Many of those would have ended in bloodshed and tragedy. The impact went far beyond those from whom the books were wrenched. 24 wagon loads of books were brought to the pyre in a square in Paris. This was long before printing reached Europe. Every book had been written by hand. Whoa. Thousands of manuscripts, each of which would have taken weeks or months to write, were burned. Many works, of which only a few copies existed, were lost to the world forever. Shmuel ben Shlomo, who may have helped Yehiel prepare for the disputation, complains that my spirit is departed, my strength exhausted, and there is no light in my eyes due to the wrath of the enemy. He forcefully overpowered us. He took the soul and delight of our eyes. We have no book in our hands to comprehend or to understand. No complete manuscript of the Talmud exists from before this time. Amongst the onlookers at the conflagration was Mir ben Baruch, a young student from the Rhineland who had gone to Paris to study with Yehiel. Distraught at the events, he followed the example of so many other traumatized scholars of his time. He expressed his grief in a lamentation. O you who have been consumed with fire, pray for the peace of those who mourn you, who long to dwell in your courts, your courts of your habitation, who choke in the dust of the earth, who grieve and are confounded by the immolation of your parchments. The censor's pen. Back in Rome, Gregory was already dead, and his successor, Celestine, only survived in the papal office for 15 days. A new pope, Innocent IV, was now on the throne. He seemed content to carry on Gregory's anti-Talmud policy. In 1244, he wrote King Louis in Paris, encouraging him in his work and urging him to continue burning all copies of the Talmud wherever they were found. But his policy would shortly change. 3 years later, after he had written to Louis, a delegation of French rabbis appeared before Pope Innocent, pleading that without the Talmud they could not understand the Bible, and reminding him that the church had long afforded the Jews the guarantee that they could practice their religion as long as it did not harm or undermine the Christian faith. Innocent listened. Oh, this is terrible, terrible, terrible. See, this is just the way one-sided, this one-sided religion always thought and functioned. Yeah. Innocent listened. He modified his stance, now ordering that all Jewish books be inspected by monks well versed in Hebrew. As long as any material harmful to Christianity was removed, the books could continue in use. This was the beginning of the policy of Talmudic censorship, a policy which continued for many centuries. Censorship was the means of separating out material of which the church did not approve, whilst allowing Jews access to their rabbinical law. Most printed copies of the Talmud today still reflect the work of the censor's pen. Oh. The advent of censorship did not remove the physical threat to the Talmud. It continued to come under attack in France. Louis IX's son, Philip, who was a weaker character than his father, came under continuing pressure from the church to legislate against the Jews. In 1283, he issued an edict which, alongside forbidding them to live in villages, chant loudly, or build cemeteries, forbade the possession of any Talmud. Any copies in their possessions were to be burnt. The next king of France, Philip the Fair, expelled the Jews in 1306, probably for financial reasons. He allowed them back 9 years later, at which time the burning of copies of the Talmud and other Jewish books in France resumed. The conflagrations continued until 1319, when the Dominican inquisitor Bernard Guy built a pyre in Toulouse. By this time, the Talmud had virtually disappeared from France, but it would return. In September 2008, Pope Benedict the 16th met Jewish leaders in Paris. The weight of history, both recent and medieval, hung heavily on both communities. In his address to the Jews, the Pope quoted from the Talmud, "It was no accident. Relations between the Church and the Talmud have come a long way since the 13th century." Maimonides under attack. The Talmud was not the first rabbinic book to be burnt. There had been an incident just a few years earlier, the consequence of a fierce dispute within Jewish intellectual circles. In this case, however, the burning had the cathartic effect of cooling tempers and restoring a sense of perspective to the disputants. Over 50 years had elapsed since the Rambam had first published his philosophical treatise, The Guide for the Perplexed. The book had caused quite a stir, and we went through that. It took us 30 sessions. Maimonides' attempt to reconcile the secular Aristotelian philosophy of the day with traditional Jewish belief had divided the intellectual world. The battle was between faith and reason. Traditionalists took exception to his view that there was no conflict between the Bible and philosophy. They held the position that a faith found on revelation could not and should not be subjected to rational examination. God's word was all that was needed. The rationalists, on the other hand, could not conceive of a world in God's revelation could conflict with his creation. The battle had started in the 2nd century BCE when the Hebrew faith first encountered Greek rationalism. A parable in the Talmud tells of 4 scholars in the time of the Mishnah who engaged in mystical contemplation. They entered the orchard, a metaphor to describe the highest levels of spiritual elevation. It was not a comfortable experience for them. Ben Azai died, Ben Zoma went mad, Elisha ben Abuya became a heretic, and only Rabbi Akiva emerged unscathed. The Talmud goes on to tell us that Greek songs never ceased from Elisha ben Abuya's mouth, and when he stood up in the study house, many heretical books fell from inside his cloak. Elisha's heresy was his study of Greek philosophy. The disparaging tales that the Talmud authors recount about him leave us in no doubt about their views of the matter. The battle between faith and reason was ancient, and in the 13th century it was by no means confined to the Jewish world. Christianity and Islam were experiencing the same tensions. It was the mood of the times. Although the Jews in Muslim lands had shared the long Islamic tradition of philosophy inquiry, many of them considered Maimonides' ideological rationalism a step too far. All the more so for those in Christian Europe who'd had far less exposure to speculative thought. Maimonides' philosophical work, The Guide for the Perplexed, was not written until he was in his 50s and was only made popularly available in Hebrew towards the end of his life. The storm over it did not erupt until after his death, but as we saw previously, there had already been disquiet over his legal compendium, Mishneh Torah, and the embers of the earlier controversy were still hot. When his critics read the guide, the storm erupted again. This time it was even more bitter. And yet, as Joseph Dan had written, although the battle was between faith and reason, the letters and pamphlets which have survived from that time do not discuss whether Maimonides was right or wrong. They concentrate only on one thing. Was there a contradiction between Maimonides and the Talmud? If there was no contradiction, if Maimonides could be shown to be in accord with tradition, then the veracity of his arguments would be proved. The rationalists, as Dan points out, succumbed to the values of their opponents who accused Maimonides of being in conflict with the Talmud. The argument was vitriolic and raged across Europe. It came to an end unexpectedly in 1232 when the Dominicans, who were busy investigating the church's own Albigensian heresy, suddenly turned their attention to the Jews and cast Maimonides' works into the flames in 1232. The Albigenses were, claimed to be earlier original forms of Christianity that didn't agree with the papacy. Maimonides' supporters hurled blame at their opponents for dragging the friars into the row, but whether the Dominicans burnt his works of their own initiative, or whether they were put up to it by the same type of fanatic who some years later desecrated his tomb in Tiberias, remains a mystery. Disputation in Barcelona. I think this is where the story of Nachmanides, the Ramban. The events had taken place in Paris, resonated throughout Europe. They particularly had an effect in Spain, where the Christian reconquest of the country was proceeding apace. The Golden Age had drawn to a close. The Muslim rulers were being driven southwards as the Christian kingdoms in the north expanded their reach. When in 1236 King Ferdinand III of Castile captured Cordova, the destiny of Spain's Jewish communities would now be shaped by events in Christian France and Germany instead of those in the Muslim world. The Dominicans, the order to which Nicholas Donin had belonged, pursued an active missionary agenda in Spain, just as they had done in France. Charged with operating the Inquisition by Pope Gregory and faithful to their responsibilities, they were fanatical defenders of Orthodox Church dogma. Although they focused their attentions equally on Muslims, Jews, and heretics, the Jews were the easiest group for the Dominicans to prey on. Unlike the Christian heretics, Jews made no attempt to conceal themselves or to disguise their religious beliefs. Fewer and less organized than the Muslims, they posed little danger. Yeah, the cowards, eh? They had no retreating co-religionists in the South who may turn the Jews, visible, unprotected, and vulnerable, were an easy target. To make things worse, several Jewish converts among the Dominican friars were actively agitating against the Talmud. as if they believed that by discrediting it, they could hasten the abolition of the Jewish faith. Nicholas Donin had been a convert, and now in Barcelona, another convert, Pablo Cristiani, began to foment against the Talmud. Even though centuries of Muslim rule had left Spanish society more tolerant towards minorities than France, the Jews were nevertheless disenfranchised. They had long been obliged to attend forced sermons at the king's command, to hear friars preach the gospel to them. In this atmosphere of strident incentive, Christiani did not need to manufacture charges against the Talmud as Donin had done. He could simply take advantage of the polemical mood to persuade the Jews of the error of their ways and of the truth of Christianity. He prevailed upon the king to order a compulsory debate. King James I of Aragon was more than willing to accede to Christiani's request. He relished the idea of debate, particularly if it could be open and cordial. He ordered that it take place in the royal palace in Barcelona and summoned the leading rabbi in Spain, Moses ben Nachman, as is traditional for the prominent rabbinic scholars. Yeah, that was the Ramban, or Nachmanides. He was known by the acrostic formed by his title and initials. The Ramban was to argue in favor of the Talmud. And there's a wonderful movie out there called The Disputation that goes through a little bit of the story of the Disputation. I think you can see a free copy of that on YouTube. The Disputation. Just look it up, and it's the story of the debate between Christiani and the Ramban. Yahiel in Paris had been a well-known and respected rabbi, but Ramban was in a different league. He was a physician by profession. He was one of those people who seem to do anything and to excel at whatever they do. He'd been the head of a rabbinic school in Girona before being appointed chief rabbi of Catalonia. And despite his religious and medical duties, he found the time to author over 50 works, principally on the Talmud, philosophy, and mysticism. He also wrote poetry. His works, particularly his commentaries on the Torah and the Talmud, are still read today. Ramban was in his late 60s when he received the king's summons. According to the account that he wrote of the debate, he only agreed to participate if he was allowed to speak freely and if the king himself agreed to take no active part. He didn't want to get into an argument with the monarch. He repeated the request to speak freely to Friar Ramon, the head of the Dominican order. Friar Ramon agreed, just as the king had already done. The disputation took place over 4 days in July of 1263. As in Paris, it was attended by the leading clergy and noblemen. Pablo Cristiani was the main advocate for the Dominicans, supported by 4 colleagues. Ramban was the sole speaker for the Talmud, although unlike the debate in Paris, other Jews were present. Cristiani opened by declaring it was his intention to prove from the Talmud that the Messiah had already come, that he was both human and divine, and that he had died to atone for human sin. He quoted Talmudic homilies in support of his view. Ramban argued that not only had Cristiani misconstrued the passages he was quoting, but that in any event, Jews were not obliged to take the folklore and stories in the Talmud literally. This is the same argument that Yahiel had used in Paris. He explained that there were 3 levels of Jewish literature: Bible, Talmud, and Aggadah. Bible was to be believed with perfect faith. The legal parts of the Talmud, which explain the commandments in the Torah, is also to be relied upon, but Aggadah should be treated like sermons. If one believes it, all well and good. If not, one will not be harmed spiritually. The debate proved inconclusive. Pablo Cristiani was not able to persuade Ramban and the other Jews present that the Messiah had already come, and Ramban was not able to refute Cristiani to a point where he could demand he cease his proselytizing activity. The king seems to have been won over by the Ramban, at least to some degree. At the end of the debate, he presented him with 300 dineros and said that he had never heard someone who was wrong argue his case so well. However, the king also decreed that he would come to the synagogue the following Sabbath with Pablo Christianity and Friar Ramon, where they would preach the gospel to the Jews. Ramban remained behind in Barcelona for the occasion to try to reassure the frightened congregation. He listened patiently while Christianity and Friar Ramon each preached to them, but leapt to his feet to protest when Friar intimated that he had been won over by Christianity during the disputation. Despite the goodwill that the king showed Ramban, he came under further pressure from the Dominicans to impose strictures upon the Jews and their Talmud. A month later, he issued a series of royal edicts in which he ordered the Jews to attend Christianity's missionary sermons whenever required. They were also required to show Christianity their books, which he would use to convince them of the truth of his case. 2 years later, the Bishop of Gerona got hold of a copy of Ramban's account of the debate. It clearly did not accord with his own understanding of what had been said because he charged him with blasphemy. Ramban appealed to the king, arguing that he had promised him freedom of speech. The king supported him, demanding that the trial be adjourned until he had the opportunity of judging it himself. The trial never took place, and the Dominicans now appealed to Pope Clement IV. He in turn ordered the Archbishop of Tarragona to seize all copies of the Talmud and other Jewish books in his kingdom and to submit them to Pablo Christiani and his fellow friars for examination and censorship. The Pope instructed the censors to return to the Jews all books which accorded with Bible and all which clearly did not contain blasphemies. By now it was obvious to Ramban that living conditions could only deteriorate, although he was well into his 70s and took the decision to leave Spain and make the perilous sea journey to Israel. He landed in Acre in 1267, where he completed the work for which he is most famous, his contemporary commentary to the Torah. His last communal role was as the rabbi of Acre. Ironically, his predecessor in the post had been Yechiel of Paris, who had also upped sticks and made the journey to Israel a few years earlier following the trauma of his disputation. These were the most famous disputations of the 13th century, but they were by no means the only ones. The accounts that both Yechiel and Ramban wrote of their experiences served as a sort of manual for others, less experienced rabbis, when they were summoned to a debate. One of the members of the committee of censors that was established in the wake of the Barcelona disputation was an erudite friar, Raimondi Martini. Martini had been singled out for a special education as a young man and had already written at least 2 polemics against Islam. In 1278, he produced his most famous work, the Pugio Fidei Adversos Moros et Judeos, or Dagger of Faith Against the Moors and the Jews. Way back in the early 5th century, St. Augustine had declared that the Jews were permitted to dwell amongst Christians due to the special status that God had given them. Unlike Christian heretics, their presence in Christian Europe had been ordained by God. Their exile and suffering was a consequence of their refusal to accept the truth of Christianity, and as such was a testament to its veracity. Successive popes had paid lip service to the doctrine, even though, as we have seen, it was breached far more frequently than it was affirmed. But despite the breaches, in theory, Augustinian protection still held good. Now, in a radical departure from Augustinian doctrine, Martini came up with a doctrinal defense of Dominican aggression. He sought to justify their mission against the Jews theologically. There was, he argued, a difference between the Jews who lived before Jesus and those after. The ancient Jews, he claimed, agreed with the Christians, but the modern Jews had willfully rejected Christianity and should be treated as heretics. God, they never stop their accusations, eh? Martini used his comprehensive knowledge of Jewish sources to assert that the Talmud actually refuted the practices of contemporary Jews. Certainly, his knowledge of Talmudic and other rabbinic texts was extensive and his argumentation complex and learned. He may well have intended the Pugio as a guide to help Christian disputants in much the same way as Yahiel and the Ramban had recorded their debates as a practical manual for those Jews who found themselves forced to disputation. It's kind of like Rabbi Singer's two-part volume series, Let's Get Biblical. Yeah. The Pugio became an essential companion for any aspiring Christian disputant for at least the next 4 centuries. It was widely copied and recopied in manuscripts. In manuscripts formed and was finally printed in 1651. It remains the most comprehensive and well-known polemic against the Talmud ever written. Meanwhile, the young student Mir ben Baruch, who had witnessed the Paris burnings and written an element lamenting the occasion, had acquired a reputation as the leading Talmudic scholar of his generation. Now an old man in his late 60s, Mir had authored many works on religious law, had served as head of the Supreme Religious Court in Germany, and was the head of the leading rabbinical academy in Europe. Over 1,000 responses of his legal responses still survive today. Back in the Rhineland, in Mir's home city of Rothenburg, conditions had greatly deteriorated. The Jews found themselves under continuing attack, and his students, who included many who would become leading lights of the next generation, feared for their lives. They prevailed on the Mir to leave Germany for a safer climate. The Pugio had already been copied and recopied many times when he set off with his family on a lengthy journey across the land and sea to settle in Israel. Mir and his fellow travelers had got as far as Lombardy when he was arrested and sent back to Germany. On his arrival, he was delivered into the hands of Habsburg Emperor Rudolf I. Rudolf, who needed to augment his treasury, decided that Mir was too good a catch to let go easily and imprisoned him, hoping to receive a hefty ransom. His followers raised 23,000 marks, but Mir refused to allow it to be paid, fearing that if he was released, this would only embolden the emperor to kidnap and hold others to ransom. Mir's followers prevailed upon the emperor to allow him to access his books, and he wrote several works whilst in prison. Mir was never released. He died 7 years later. The Spread of Kabbalah. For the best part of a millennium, the Talmud had been the preeminent non-biblical corpus in the Jewish world. True, the Mishnah was older, and the Talmud's authority was based on the fact that it interpreted the Mishnah, but the two works were so close that the older had effectively been absorbed into the newer. They were even written as one, but a new work was appearing on the scene, one which, while paying lip service to the supremacy of the Talmud, would come in time, in certain places and amongst certain people, to rival and even occasionally to surpass it. The practice of Jewish mysticism was as old as the faith itself. The book of Ezekiel opens with the prophet's mystical vision of God's throne, known as the heavenly chariot, and the Talmud itself refers to two distinct types of mystics: those who contemplate the works of the chariot and those who busy themselves with the works of creation. The tale above about the 4 scholars who entered the orchard is one of several mystical narratives in the Talmud. Mystical texts, too, had been known for centuries. The oldest, the Book of Creation, dates back to the 5th century and seems to have been in regular use. Saadia Gaon's composed a commentary to it in 931. Mystical texts were often structured similarly to the homiletic collections that were composed in the Talmudic period in Israel, and recounted the supernatural exploits of Talmudic sages, even though in most, if not all cases, the name of the sage was only adduced to give the narrative credibility. But although there were almost certainly a long-standing undercurrent of mysticism in Jewish circles, we hear little of it until the 12th century, when mystical schools emerged in both Spain and Germany. All the prominent earlier mystics were students of the Talmud. Ramban, who had conducted the dispute in Barcelona, wrote commentaries on parts of the Talmud and on the Torah. His Torah commentary offers both rational and mystical interpretations. The pietists in Germany produced works which used Talmudic traditions as a starting point, but then set off on mystical tangents. But many mystics were ambivalent about the study of Talmud. They felt it focused too much on rigid legal analysis and downplayed the importance of spiritual and ethical matters. The Talmudists had abandoned the quest for God in favor of the precise formulation of the law. In these circles, a new category of ethical law emerged, the law of heaven. It didn't override the laws of Talmud. A crime was still a crime, but the Talmud's mechanical application of the law was subordinated to an absolute morality, a crime which necessitated a greater struggle against the evil inclination, such as when a pious but starving man steals food is to be judged less harshly than a theft instigated by wicked intent. Very important. Similarly, Talmudic law forbids people spitting at each other, but there is only a penalty for damages if the spit lands on that person. Heavenly law focuses exclusively on the intent. Spitting is an offense wherever it may land. During the 13th century, mystical pamphlets began to circulate in Castile and Spain. By the end of the century, they had been compiled into a collection known as the Zohar, which means radiance. As befits any mystical tome, the origins of the Zohar are lost in the midst of time. Traditionally, it is ascribed to Shimon ben Yochai, a 2nd century pupil of Rabbi Akiva. Until recently, the academic view was that it had been composed by 13th century Spanish mystic Moses de Leon. However, the language and complexity of the work suggests that it is a compendium of texts that may have been edited together by Moses de Leon and his colleagues, but much of it was a significantly earlier provenance. Over the coming centuries, the Zohar would prove to be a challenging companion to the Talmud. Some considered it to be the more important of the two. Asher Lemlin, a 16th century Kabbalist, mocked those who thought the study of the mundane laws was more important than knowledge of the Creator. He likened the Talmudist to a king's worker and the Kabbalist to those who sat alongside the monarch in his council. Interesting. Printers and Polemics, Chapter 10. Rabbi Hanina said, everything comes from heaven except for cold drafts. Forced and not so forced conversions. By the 14th century, the southward march of Christian armies into Islamic territory in Spain was all but over. Granada was the only area to remain in Muslim hands. The victory of the cross over the Crescent Land to an outpouring of religious triumphalism. Actions to convert the Jews to Christianity increased dramatically. They were seen as not just the enemies of God in Christendom. They'd been exposed as heretics, forsaking the Bible and placing themselves under the jurisdiction of the Talmud. The conversion drive was not without success. At first, a trickle of converts made their way towards Christianity, some out of genuine belief, others from expediency. The trend accelerated as the century wore on until 1391. An outbreak of riots and pogroms directed against the Jews led to a bursting of the floodgates. Suddenly, the conversos, as they were called, were numbered not in their tens, hundreds, or thousands, but in their myriads. About half of the Jewish population is thought to have converted. But the conversion policy backfired. Mainstream Spanish society was wholly unprepared for an event of such magnitude. Instead of just Jews and Christians, the Muslims had long been forced out. The population now comprised three distinct groups: old Christians, Jews, and conversos, or new Christians. It didn't bode well for the conversos. The old Christians represented the sudden influx of people who, almost overnight, had moved from the fringes of society to its heart and now demanded the same rights and privileges as those who had always been loyal to the cross. What did it matter, argued the old Christians, if these people had changed their religion? They still had Jewish blood in their veins. And wasn't it the case, they added, that most of them still kept up their Jewish practices as if they had never converted? The conversos' dilemma was that it was one thing to submit to pressure to convert to avoid persecution and oppression. It is quite another thing to give up the habits, practices, and beliefs of a lifetime. Many conversos started to live a dual life. They were Christians in the public, but in secret, the clandestine underground existence, they were still Jews. Stories began to circulate of converso women sweeping their houses on Friday when surely Saturday was the time for Sabbath preparations. When these women had finished sweeping, they were seen placing pots of food in the embers of their fires to keep it warm for the following day. And when sun set on a Friday evening, they lit candles. Some were said to even to be holding secret prayer services in their homes. If these practices, which were nothing more than traditional Jewish Sabbath preparations, had been ordained by the Bible, they'd have been no problem. They may have been what native-born Christians did, but nor would they have imitated a rejection of Christianity. But they weren't biblical practices. The Bible commands the Sabbath, but it's the Talmud that ordains the practices the conversos were following. The difference probably didn't even occur to them. They were only doing what they had always done, but they weren't doing what the church had expected of them. They'd accepted Christianity, but they hadn't rejected the Talmud. One man rejected it, though. As a child, he'd been known as Solomon Halevi. He was raised in a learned home. He was well educated and had grown into a skilled Talmudist, even engaging in erudite correspondence with the leading scholars in Spain, Rabbi Isaac ben Shichet. He qualified as a rabbi and ministered to the Castilian town of Burgos. Until he converted to Christianity, he changed his name to Pablo de Santa Maria. He became a bishop. And like Nicholas Donin, Pablo Cristiani, and so many converts before him, he became an ideological opponent of the Talmud. Pablo de Santa Maria was not only distinguished converso Talmudist to become a Christian scholar. Another was Geronimo de Santa Fe. He wrote Hebraeomastics, an anti-Jewish treatise in which he attacked the Talmud, taking his arguments directly from Ramon Martini's Pujo Fide. He caught the eye of the church dignitaries in Avignon in Provence. The Catholic Church had recently split. There was now a pope in Rome and another Benedict the 13th in Avignon. Benedict, who was known as the anti-pope, had jurisdiction over Spain. He engaged Geronimo de Santa Fe to conduct yet another disputation, this time in Tortosa. There had been many disputations by this time, but Tortosa hosted the longest of them all. It lasted for over a year, with one short break. Its purpose, as always, was to persuade the Jews of their errors and of their ways and to oblige them to convert. No new arguments were raised or compelling insights evoked. But the Jews were on the back foot, their leadership weak and their spirits shattered. By the time it finished, many of the Jewish delegates who were so exhausted by the year-long ordeal and so impoverished by the time spent away from their trades had converted out of desperation. And that's the way Christianity functions, and this is their spiritual abuse. I find this so disgusting behavior that, it's a do as we say or we will make you pay religion. And I'm doing another part today in our spiritual abuse series with my friend Steve Eisenhower. Today we'll be talking about their not original sin, their doctrine of total depravity. So, yeah. So we'll show how it's abusive, and that look for that later tonight. It'll be posted on social media. Anyways, but ugh. More than a century had now passed since the first conversos were baptized, but the resentment of the old Christian hadn't abated. When 9 days of rioting broke out in 1467, the king brought in legislation against the newcomers. He decreed that no converso could hold an official position in Toledo or Ciudad Real. The old Christians blamed the Jews for conversos' inability to integrate. They argued that there was too much contact, the conversos were too close to the Jews, and they remained under their influence. In order to bring the conversos in line, to teach them to be true to their new faith, all traces of heresy would have to be rooted out. King Ferdinand, their hatred just doesn't end. King Ferdinand, who was himself partly descended from Jewish stock, consulted the bishops. The bishops' solution took even the old Christians by surprise. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. The Inquisition was established in 1480 with a mandate to purge all heresy from those conversos who, despite their pledge to Christianity, were really crypto Jews. There had been previous papal inquisitions in Spain, but this was the first to be set up under royal mandate, led by the notorious Thomas de Torquemada. It sought to root out and prosecute anyone who had been spotted observing Talmudic law. A handbook written to guide the inquisitors advised them that the Bible decreed eternal damnation for heretics. There was every justification, therefore, for guilty conversos to be put to death. You see how they rationalize, just like the Germans in World War II, rationalize their deadly infliction. Yeah, but punishing guilty conversos wouldn't solve the underlying problem. To ensure that no taint of Jewish influence could contaminate those who were not yet guilty, in 1492, Ferdinand and his Queen Isabella expelled all the Jews from Spain. 1,500 years of unbroken Jewish settlement came to an end. Wow. 1492 was one of those rare years in which everything changes all at once. Granada, the last remaining Muslim kingdom in Spain, fell to Christian conquerors. Christopher Columbus landed in America. By the end of the year, there were Spaniards in America, but there were no longer any Muslims or Jews in Spain. And Andres de Bernaldez, a Spanish priest who watched the Jews pack up and leave, reported that there was no sight more pitiable. There was not a Christian who did not feel their pain. As the departing Jews packed their bags, they took their copies of the Talmud with them. Not all were densely written manuscripts, carefully inscribed. A few of the exiles, the wealthiest and those renowned for their scholarship, carried with them the products of the very latest technology. Some of them took the new technology itself. As the Talmud cast its final backward glance at Spain, it did so from a printed folio. The age of the scribe and their manuscripts was coming to an end. Printing had arrived, and a new chapter in the history of the Talmud was about to begin. Yeah, the printing press was considered the biggest invention of the last millennia for sure. Without it, you wouldn't have any degree of education in the planet today. People don't realize prior to the printing press how prevalent illiteracy was. And when you're dealing with a society of illiterates, just the type of function is more and more base and debased. So the printing press, was definitely a godsend for sure. Printing the Talmud. The earliest known Spanish imprints of the Talmud were produced in Guadalajara, a little way to the northeast of Madrid. The ancient town had been founded in the 8th century on the site of an old Roman settlement. By the 15th century, it was the seat of the Mendoza family, patrons of the arts and literature. Like so many earlier homes of the Talmud, it was a cultured city. The refined atmosphere was just the setting to stimulate an interest in printing and the construction of the earliest presses. The few surviving printed volumes of the Talmud from Spain and contemporaneous editions from Portugal contain Rashi's commentary in the outer margins and the main text in the center. They don't always exactly correspond exactly to texts printed to today. The reason is that for the whole of its early life, the Talmud was mainly transmitted by word of mouth. The manuscripts, but not everyone possessed them. And the Talmud is such a large document that virtually nobody had a complete copy. Students were taught to memorize their studies. Rote learning was the order of the day. Oral texts are fluid and organic. Not everyone has perfect memory. When manuscripts began to be produced, successive scribes and readers inserted comments or even amended texts, an activity which was considered quite acceptable. It wasn't until it was printed that the text became fixed. Printing brought many benefits, but it set in stone an opus which had started life as an organic tradition. If we think of the transmission of an oral text as a continuous process, like a shifting landscape of a desert sands, then a printed copy is a snapshot taken at a moment in time, a random but defining, apparently authentic configuration of the sands, or in our case, the text of the moment the shutter was pressed. The reason why modern editions of the Talmud differ from the early Spanish volumes is simply that they were based on different manuscripts, with different printers making different decisions about how the text should read. The early imprints were only of the individual volumes, 37 of which make up the full set. In 1483, round about the same time as the Spanish volumes were being produced, Joshua Solomon of Soncino in northern Italy established his Hebrew printing press. Amongst the works he and his nephew Gershom produced were several volumes of the Talmud, complete with Rashi and Tosafot commentaries. Gershom Soncino became known as one of the leading printers of his generation. In the course of his lifetime, he produced over 100 Hebrew titles and a similar number of Latin, Greek, and Italian works. But although the Soncino family would go down in history as pioneers, their work on the Talmud was shortly to be eclipsed by an even more ambitious project taking place in Venice, a little over 100 miles to the east. Printing the Talmud standardized the text and brought it within the reach of a much wider audience. Adding commentaries to the printed page, something that was unknown in manuscripts, revolutionized the method of study. But a full 40 years was to elapse from when the Soncinos produced their first volumes until the first completed printed copy of the whole Talmud was produced. And that full copy may well never have been seen the light at all had it not been for the revolution that was taking place in the church, the challenge of the Reformation, and the emergence of the early Christian Hebraists. The laid table. Amongst the families who had been driven out of Spain was that of Ephraim Caro. They had hailed from Toledo and, following the expulsion, settled in Turkey, where Ephraim taught the Talmud to his son Yosef. Yosef was a sensitive young man who kept a diary in which his conversations he had with a heavenly mentor. He described this mentor, known as the Majid in mystical terminology, as a personification of the Mishnah. One of his companions, Solomon Alkabetz, records that he heard the Majid speaking from Joseph's mouth. Yosef Caro's mystical proclivities led him to settle in Safat, the city in northern Israel, which was home to the new burgeoning Kabbalist movement. Caro became one of Safat's leading lights. With a profound knowledge of the Talmud, he could see that in the 300 years since Maimonides had written his legal code, the Mishnah Torah, the legal landscape in the widely scattered Jewish world had become almost anarchic. Caro explained about the many books of law and practice that were circulating. It was as if everyone was writing books and nobody knowing which opinion to follow. Caro's solution to this was to write a book, but his was not a book like any other. He took as his starting point a work known as the Arba'a Turim, or Four Rows, named after the four sets of stones on the ancient high priest's breastplate. The Arba'a Turim, commonly abbreviated as the Tur, had been written by Jacob, the son of Asher ben Yehiel, a pupil of Mir of Rothenburg, who had been held captive by Rudolf, the Habsburg emperor. Jacob had written the Tur in the early 14th century. He had based it in part on Maimonides' Mishneh Torah, but unlike Maimonides, he cited Talmudic sources of the law, omitted everything that was no longer relevant, such as an ancient order of service in the Jerusalem temple, and introduced rulings by the French and German scholars who, by and large, lived and worked after the Rambam. The Tur had served its purpose, but Caro saw the need to expand it, bring it up to date, and produce an authoritative guide to the law that would be applicable everywhere and serve to assist rabbis and judges in their decision making. He produced a commentary on the Tur, which he called the Bet Yosef. It was the most comprehensive guide to Jewish law that had ever been produced, both in its breadth and content and the manner in which it explains things. I think we're talking about the Shulchan Aruch. Louis Jacobs described it as the keenest work of legal analysis in the history of Jewish law. The Bet Yosef was so monumentous that once he finished it, Caro felt compelled to produce a digest. He decided to write a work for young students to help them clearly know the law. Unlike the Bet Yosef, it would not contain complex analysis. This book would be laid out like a table is for a meal, with everything to hand and clearly in its place. He called it Shulchan Aruch, or the laid table. Shortly after the Shulchan Aruch was written, Moses Israels of Krakow in Poland criticized its Sephardic outlook. The Sephardim were the Jews who had originated in Spain, who often had different customs from the Northern Europeans, or Ashkenazim. Israels interpolated his comments into Caro's work whenever he felt the Ashkenazi practice needed to be recorded. Caro's Shulchan Aruch, printed with Israel's glosses, is still the unchallenged compendium of Jewish law. Keep that in mind, folks. Although a changing world has led to a plenitude of new works dealing with technical, social, scientific, and economic matters of which Caro and Israels would have had no conception, the Shulchan Aruch still lies beneath them all as the law code par excellence, the definitive summary of how things should be done. The scholars in the old academies of Babylon, with their multifaceted view of the world and their reluctance to provide definitive rulings, would have been astonished. You know what? I think we want to stop it there. Shalom, Dave Tuttle. I think, we've now taken it through the Talmud to the time of the Shulchan Aruch. I think that's a good place to stop for today. And let's aim to be back tomorrow for more Rocky Mountain readings, where we will continue to read more of the Talmud, a biography, and we'll get into the Christian Hebraists. And I think that this is amazing, because now you're at the time of the Reformation, once Martin Luther started to challenge the Christian church, and then you end up with that 30-year war, which was so bloody in Europe, where the Christians were killing other Christians. It's so funny when their hatred gets turned on themselves, and for all the wickedness that they did during the Inquisition, it's just mind blowing. And I have saw that degree of hatred even in our day and age. That their authority structure is all about outgroup derogation, and I'm going to share a little bit more about it today when I do my presentation with Steve Eisenhower on his Rediscovering God page, and we're talking about a spiritual abuse series, and we're going to tackle today their doctrine of not original sin, total depravity, and we're gonna discuss how it's abusive, and they just keep getting it wrong, and if you don't agree with them, they'll punish you one way, shape, or form, or get their hate on. It's horrible, but I think we're seeing how with this work, we're seeing how the Hebrew people survived such adversity and hatred through many, many, many years. But I think this is kind of a marking milestone that we've reached the point of the Shulchan Aruch, which still stands today, as they mentioned, as unchallenged compendium of Jewish law. And it's intended to be decisive. This is what the law states. Whereas the Talmud like to leave open-ended scenarios because of the differences in scenario, right? They didn't want to say, here's the exact prescription, lest somebody apply a precedence without considering all of the situation that differs, right? It's just as like human beings today, we're all unique and we all have opinions, but that doesn't justify having moral relativism, right? It just doesn't. And I think the Shulchan Aruch's openness, or the Talmud's openness, was to account for that tendency of humanity to look for some kind of relativistic uniqueness. And sadly, Torah law is intended to be clear. And I think the rabbis passing this tradition and even solidifying it into the Shulchan Aruch are there to be clear. And there's nothing worse than trying to play a board game without the rules, right? It just doesn't make sense without the rules. And life isn't a game. It's serious. So, may we all look at it properly. So, we're going to sign out of Rocky Mountain Readings for now, but we will be back tomorrow for more of the Talmud, a biography, Hashem willing. And we wish you all a wonderful day. Bye for now.